Welcome to SportsLit. I'm Neil Acharya.
And I am Nate Sager.
If it were a normal year, the Raptors would be tipping off right now to celebrate their 25th season. Instead, they're not too far removed from a second-round playoff bubble exit at the hands of the Boston Celtics, a tournament they entered as the defending champions. How improbable that is to hear is a good reason why you may want to read Doug Smith's book, We the North, which celebrates and chronicles the roller coaster ride that has been this franchise's story since they tipped off against the New Jersey Nets on Friday, November 3rd, 1995. Smith has been a day one reporter, and so he has seen it all literally. And what he really saw is the city coming of age in many ways. It added another major sport and a franchise that needed you and showed it and thus reflected it. And that was never more evident than when the turnout we saw on June 17, 2019 for the championship parade. So for more on We the North with Doug Smith, I turn it over to my colleague, Nate Sager.
Yeah, that was a nice birthday present. They all came to celebrate Neil's birthday, everyone.
Was it 2 million?
Yeah,
1 million?
Yeah, Neil dropped 41 that day, just like Chris Bosh dropped 41 the first time we went to a Raptors game together in 2007. Neil, a transcendent team, I think it gives you something that fits with the story you tell about yourself. The Toronto Raptors are riveting to their thousands of Canadian fans for that reason, since this team was, built by and with people who all had to overcome something. Those stories have been told very well by our guest Doug Smith today and, other basketball writers, often by the players themselves. You should be able to see something of yourself maybe a little bit in every guy, like find that one guy on the floor. My Raptors, Serge Ibaka, he comes off the bench. He brings a lot of elbow grease. He gets those 50-50 rebounds. He's not a scorer, but when he hits baskets, it always seems to be in games when they really need it, when the team's fraying a little. This is going to be a bit of a TLDR portion of the show. I have some real give me 5 Bs for a quarter energy when it comes to the Raptors, their early days, and my bond with basketball. Now, a grown-ass man should not tether his self-worth to the fortunes of his favorite teams. Like the BoJack Horseman principle. You are responsible for your own happiness. I know that. Please don't remind me of it. Doug Smith was on the Pound the Rock podcast last week and told Joseph Cascario that, We the North, he decided it needed to show what was from the beginning, what was happening in the 90s that made it possible for the Toronto Raptors to win the NBA championship in 2019. And I can tell you as a fan, there's just days I'll randomly wake up and I'll be like, that happened? The Raptors won the Raptors won the championship. Capturing the spirit of the thing means segueing into where I was in the 95-96 basketball season, when the Raptors were an expansion team, playing in the Sky Dome, and Doug was trying to work on his deadline stories while they were dismantling the basketball court around him. Neil, you touched on this. I think we sensed how the sportscape was shifting in Canada when we were teenagers growing up in and around Kingston, Ontario. It calls to mind the Windows trick that they used to use on The Office for the talking heads when someone speaks to the camera. The characters who did not have any future outside Dunder Mifflin, they used to put them in front of interior windows. It was like the demotivational plaque in Homer Simpson's workspace. Don't forget, you're here forever. And then they put the characters who had a future outside Dunder Mifflin in front of exterior windows. For our purposes in 1995, hockey was the window into Canadian sports past, which is valuable. But the arrival of the Raptors was a window into the coming 21st century. There was this multicultural major city. Toronto's one of the biggest cities in the world, in North America. It's a global city. And it was primed to rally around Raptors basketball if they ever started to win. And Doug Smith was right in on the ground floor. And there was uncertainty and I guess a fragility at the time. Uncertainty with ownership, the arena, Canada had about a 65-cent dollar at the time. But before we get to that, basketball is unique among the team sports because I think it's one where, a loner or an outsider or an introvert can kind of find acceptance, kind of like the music world. You can play full court, you can play half court with, 2-on-2, or you can just get some shots up on your own some. I'm reminded, one of my favorite sports writers is Steve Rushin, who, wrote for Sports Illustrated in the 90s. He has his 2 memoirs about his childhood in Minnesota, Stingray Afternoons and Nights in White Castle. Russian had a similar upbringing to our recent guest, Brian Burke. Grew up in a large Catholic family in Minnesota that, put an emphasis on sports and getting an education, and Minnesota's the state of hockey. Russian's eldest brother, he played college hockey under Lou Lamoriello at Providence College, just like Brian Burke did. And Russian's youngest brother played hockey for the University of Notre Dame. But Russian just, Steve Russian, introvert, felt more himself, felt more comfortable with that round ball in his hands instead of a, curved Sherwood. Plus, gyms are warmer than a hockey rink. So he became, the gym rat who, loved R&B and funk. I relate to that. Back in the 90s, among my friends in my rural southeastern Ontario high school, we were as passionate about basketball as hockey. It was 50-50. We started to shift from, getting together to skate on the pond to shoot hoops. And the music you hear people coming out of people's headphones was shifting from, hair metal to hip hop. We're the last dance generation. The basketball world and the music world coming together isn't necessarily new. I think it was corporate America, corporate Canada playing catch up. A brief digression, to the New York Rens almost a century ago. They were a black-owned team in the 1920s and 30s, and they used to play games in courts set up in a ballroom, and then after the game, there would be a dance. The Rens actually won the first professional basketball championship in 1939, but sadly they disbanded because they weren't accepted as a franchise into the early NBA. But the team is inducted en masse into the Basketball Hall of Fame. So, in Bath, we'd get a winter thaw. My buddy Jay Wags McKegney, the sixth man for the Ernestown Eagles, the guy who was like our three-point shooting specialist, he'd call some people, they'd call some people, but, to get together and play. Like in January in like long pants and coats, Wiggs would grab snow shovels and a push broom from his parents' house so we could, clear the court behind St. Linus School of like snow, slush, gravel, and get our hoop on. So that passion for basketball was there across Canada, maybe, below the radar. Of course, when Vince Carter arrived with the Raptors in 1999, that changed the scope. He is the most globally popular athlete who ever played on a Canadian team, I think. But before that, movers and shakers in Toronto and Vancouver saw that their kids loved the NBA and they wanted to sell them on supporting their own team. I think that needs to be there, complementing, the Carter effect narrative that we've, had. Just save some space for the idea that something was trickling up from Generation X. And in We the North, Doug Smith says, hey, there was skepticism about whether the NBA was going to work in Canada. And you kind of think, wow, really? But, look at the state of pro sports in Canada at the time. 2 NHL teams pulled up stakes to move to the U.S. The Montreal Expos had basically become a zombie franchise, well before the 1994-95 Major League Baseball strike. The Toronto Blue Jays were under, absentee foreign ownership. The CFL had its, ill-fated U.S. expansion experiment. And, of course, the other team that came in with the Raptors, the Vancouver Grizzlies, lasted only 6 seasons in Vancouver. But there was that energy, and I connect that to some brilliant people I knew at the time through being a bench warmer for Ernestown. And that energy was looking for a place to happen, to borrow the title of a song by Kingston's own The Tragically Hip. Now, if it seems like a stretch to connect the Raptors with the late, great Gord Downie, keep in mind one of Gord's last public appearances was at a Raptors playoff game in 2017 where, he and, Drake gave him some dap. It was, a great moment. Now I think every sports media personality in Canada wrote about the Hip's relationship to hockey at some point. It's an easy column, but for me, I always have that memory burn of Gord Downie sitting courtside at a Raptors game. In his jean jacket and signature hat, as my fellow buddy from Bath, Joey Horrocks, once put it, no one ever rocked the Canadian tuxedo like Gord did. And I imagine Gord just was absorbing the game in a way artists appreciate other artists who work in another medium or form. And if you're privileged enough to sit at courtside at an NBA or WNBA game, those leagues produce the world's premier athletic show. You have to be up close to really get a sense of their skill and quickness that is, backed up by that 99th percentile height and strength. So, 1995, a million miles away from the NBA, obviously. That was when Rob Smart transferred to Ernestown. Rob would go on to become an all-Canadian guard with the Carleton Ravens, playing for his uncle, the legendary Dave Smart. Rob's now a prof in the business school at Carleton and a longtime assistant coach, first with Dave, now alongside Taffy Charles. Now, I think people know about Carleton's dominance of university basketball. 15 men's titles in the last 18 years. The women's team's also won one too. Rob's actually the only person who won a title as a player, assistant coach, and head coach, because he filled in one season when his uncle was on a sabbatical. Now, I also have to build in the lay of the land in Kingston High School sports around that time. Now, you think, Ernestown got this big-time transfer, so you must have been already, a jock school. No, the fact that I could be on the basketball and hockey teams is proof otherwise. Ernestown wasn't like that. If you wanted to look for a school like that, it was probably the 3 West End schools around where Neil grew up. Frontenac, Bay Ridge, Holy Cross. I still hate Holy Cross. Anyway, a quick snapshot from 2009. Frontenac grad Stu Turnbull was the most valuable player at the Canadian University Men's Basketball Final 8 after helping Carleton win another championship. The Memorial Cup MVP was future NHL star Taylor Hall, who attended Frontenac while he was playing youth hockey in Kingston before he went on to the major junior Windsor Spitfires and greater stardom. On the final weekend of the 2009 Canadian football season, our alma mater, Queen's University, won the Vanier Cup. And a Bay Ridge grad, Scott Valberg, caught 2 touchdown passes, and a Holy Cross grad, Devin Sheehan, caught Queen's other touchdown pass. The next day, Rob Bagg, Frontenac, and Queen's grad played wide receiver for Saskatchewan in the Grey Cup. And that 2009 Carleton team actually had 2 Frontenac Falcons in their starting 5, the other being Rob Saunders, who was their defensive stopper. And their star forward was Aaron Dornekamp, the last in the line of Dave Smart's 7 nephews and nieces who went from Ernestown to play higher level basketball. Speaking of Aaron, by the way, and this is proof that all Canadians know each other, he wrote a testimonial for Carl English's memoir, Chasing a Dream, which Neil has mentioned in both our Jeff Pearlman and Brian Burke episodes. Small world, eh? So at Ernestown, at that time, the Smarts showed me that basketball could be a first choice sport for a Canadian. Like this, up until then was just something you played for fun. You never connected yourself with, the top levels of the sport. Now, as dedicated Ravenologists know, when Carleton adds one member of family, it tends to add all of them. Their press kits should include family trees along with the roster and the stats. Recent stars like Phil and Tommy Scrub are, a perfect example. So at that point, Rob comes into play for us. Dave was in his 20s, a year removed from being an all-conference guard at Queen's. As people know, Dave had gone and coached for a few years before he, went and dominated university basketball. So we had Robbie as our point guard. His younger brother and fellow future Raven star, Michael Smart, was the point guard of our junior boys team. Most of the core players on Ernestown's girls varsity, including Dave's niece, future Dr. Amy Dornekamp, she's a veterinarian now, played in his Lennox and Addington Guardsman Club program, which eventually transferred up to Ottawa. And so that year, Dave was around Ernestown helping, coach hoops at this small school. He didn't impose himself. We had a good coach for the senior varsity teams, Tom Turnbull, Stu's dad. Tom's daughter, Taryn Turnbull, who went on to play D1 in the States and professionally overseas. She was actually in the same grade as Neil at Frontenac. Again, because all Canadians know each other. Basketball is now all, a pace and space, three-pointers and layups emphasizing environment. It was a different game in the 90s, but Dave's Carleton teams, I can tell you, they were playing like that 10, 15 years ago before it came into vogue in the pros and NCAA D1. And actually, the first time I heard about what's now called positionless basketball, where any of the 5 players can lead the offense, was from the girls that Dave coached with the Guardsmen. So you could tell at that time it was just a matter of when Dave and, basically the whole Smart family would take their talents to a Canadian university. Dave has that maximum Canada view of, making it big, making something bigger, hat tip to the writer Doug Saunders. But Canadian University's sports model kind of originated from a minimum Canada mindset, just try to keep the lights on, that sort of thing. Based on what Neil and I remember of Queen's, I don't think, Dave would have fit there as a coach, with the ambition he had. Our old school was, old school. But Carleton could have used a rallying point back in the 90s. It's in Ottawa, our nation's capital. In politics, they have that phrase, change the channel. Well, late 90s, Carleton University needed to change the channel on all the Carleton, where the K stands for quality jokes. They were beefing up the basketball program while cutting football, which people thought was going to, set the university back 20 years. How did that work out? So it was a great place for a disruptor such as Dave, who had a vision to create a uniquely Canadian basketball juggernaut that really hadn't been seen other than Ken Shields' University of Victoria teams in the 80s. Now 2 decades later, across, the university sports landscape, obviously it's on pause now because of the pandemic, but, we have a handful of D1 quality teams, and it's done in a player development driven setting, not one dictated by TV deals. Players get that extra season to play. There's no crazy restrictions on practice time. They can be together 11 months a year if they want. But before all that, the harmonic convergence that kind of happened at Ernesttown. Rob sort of slid in as the star with this, ragtag team that we had. Schools like, Bay Ridge, they would have these nice warm-up suits with names on their shooting shirts, the tearaway pants with their jersey number on the leg. You know what our warm-ups were, Neil?
I do not.
No, yeah, we had these gray cotton T-shirts that said, Ernesttown basketball, we can play. Because we assumed people just saw us walking in the gym and it was like, who are these guys? And instead of, last names on the back, we had, silly nicknames like Bricklayer, Rainbow, Wags, Madman, Rooster. Of course, Rob's smart shirt just said, smart. Rob's a fun guy, but, we could not pull, him down to our level. Scoff at us, take us lightly, we'll beat you, or at least we'll get your respect trying. So I guess my Ernestownness and Raptorness is both sort of inferiority and superiority complex, at the same time. Now, I realize now, that I'm a little older, that Neil and his homies at Frontenac and the kids at the other schools, they probably didn't look down at us. We put the chip on our shoulders. But we had to get respect in basketball since Ernesttown did not have football. The one chirp we often heard was, you have a horse instead of a football team. It was part of local lore that Ernesttown had spent money meant for starting a football team on this statue of a horse that was erected in front of the school back in the 1960s. In my parents' day, the horse was an easy toilet papering target for Halloween vandals. My dad was actually part of the Ernesttown Horse Patrol 1 year. They would, basically gather around, guard the horse from vandals, fortified with liquid courage through, stubbies of Labatt 50. So that's, part of how I became, the guy who always goes for the underdog. And the Raptors, in their early days, they fit in with that. They dared to be different. And they were an expansion team, too. Let the other teams wear the classic understated uniforms like, the Lakers purple and gold. We're putting the dinosaur right on the jerseys. They didn't care if someone laughed at it, because that meant that person wasn't in on the bit. But maybe they would get in on it once they saw the kids liked it. And Doug points this out in the book. The NBA owners really put the screws to Toronto and Vancouver by saying they couldn't draft the number 1 overall for 3 years, and they could not spend to the salary cap. It was an overreaction, to the Orlando Magic winning the Shaquille O'Neal lottery in 1992 and then winning the lottery again the following year. So that contributed to the us against the world mentality. Now, I got to mention the other cannot miss kid who wore Eagle Green son. Adnan Virk was in my grade at Ernesttown. He was a basketball teammate there too. And for my money, today Adnan is the best Canadian sports host going. He just happens to work in the United States. Adnan is on DAZN, MLB Network, NHL Network, Yahoo Sports Canada. He hosts an NFL podcast, the GM Shuffle. He has a Cinephile podcast. He was the first Muslim anchor at ESPN, which has, been very important for helping foster diversity and inclusion. So, give Adnan all the agency in his well-earned success. Just know that people who knew him at, 15 or 16, 17 years old, we expected it because he hustled. He worked on his dream of, being a TV sports anchor, and he bet big on himself, moved to Toronto at 18 to start getting reps. With him, I sometimes associate that with how you see the YouTube video of 13-year-old Seth Rogen doing stand-up comedy. He doesn't look like a kid quoting comedy routines or, trying to be someone else. He already is the Seth Rogen we know now, so it goes with the greats. So like Dave and Rob Smart, Adnan was a young man with a plan. And on the basketball team, his character shone by, practicing and playing hard when he subbed into games, and that helped their chemistry. It contributed to us achieving our goal of a championship season in 96.
Party at the Moon Tower.
Yeah, all right. So those are the humble origin stories that tie in with my Raptors devotion. All these people who happen to be in the same corner of the world who were looking for a place to happen and getting defensive stops along the way. The Raptors were outsiders. I felt like an outsider. They became, the NBA's lone Canadian team. You always felt like they're ignored by the American media. You see those memes about, compare basketball and hockey players' toughness. Please like my sport. So the Raptors were down more than up from like 1995 to about 2013, outside of the Vince Carter years. And that time always kind of felt like an illusion, to someone who had, rooted for the Chicago Bulls before the Raptors came along. You look at the great stars of the last 30 years and how many times they made the NBA all-defensive team. Kobe Bryant, who's, I guess Vince Carter's contemporary, they're about the same age. Just Kobe got in the league earlier because he came straight from high school. Kobe Bryant was 12-time all-NBA defensive team. Michael Jordan, 9 times all-defensive team. LeBron James has been on the all-defensive team 6 times. Kawhi Leonard, 6 times in just 8 full seasons. You know how many times Vince Carter was an all-defensive pick? 0. But around 2013, 14, the Raptors became a solid playoff team. But you always had this like sort of force pushing down, like DeMar DeRozan has these limitations. Kyle Lowry has these limitations. They would have the solid regular seasons, but there were always the fears they were going to get trashed in the playoffs. And then there were the little Bronto memes. Most of them were actually pretty funny. But we Raptors fans knew all that. Who's more brutally honest about their team than a true fan? But still, we hoped against hope. 2018. So Kawhi Leonard joins a team of, full of players who all overcame something. Now, if your favorite team is good and lucky enough to approach their sports summit, you just know. You get in a zone. And that doesn't happen too often unless you, cheer for teams from Boston. It's rare for me, I know. Nate Sager sounds like naysayer for a reason, fam. And when you have like depression like I do, I think despair and bargaining, like bubble up a lot. Thankfully, I have many friends, especially Neil, who help me up every time I take a charge and feel like I got called for a blocking foul. Hey, analogies. So May 12th, 2019, I watched Game 7 of the 76ers Raptors playoff series on my laptop. Doug writes on page 211 of We the North, nobody played particularly well. And that kind of contributed to the tension for an observer. You maybe your team won't win, but you want them to walk off the court knowing they did everything they could. And that just didn't happen that day. And so the Raptors got the last shot to make a series-winning basket at the end of the fourth quarter. And when Kawhi Leonard's buzzer beater bounced off the rim the first time, I turned away from the screen thinking, oh, he missed. I guess we're going to overtime. I've got to brace for that. It was like a full 2 seconds from the first bounce off of the rim to the fateful fourth bounce. And I heard the crowd roar and thought, did the refs actually call a foul on the 76ers or something? And then the on-court celebration started. And on my end, I just remember I started laughing because it was like that play in the World Series the other night. It was just so improbable. And then the laughter kind of like gave way to sobbing. It was just like this, this release. Team of destiny is a cliche, but I relate this a little bit to say it was catharsis, a word I had to look up the first time I heard Gord Downie sing it on a song called Every Irrelevance. This dam of doubt just burst, and the rest. When the Raptors won the NBA title a month later, I was at work, I watched it on a newsroom TV, and I went back to my desk since, the happy tears were just flowing like champagne, and I felt a little embarrassed, because you're, in a room full of all these, newsroom veterans who, don't react to much of anything. But I took the Raptors flag I had in my workspace home, and I just walked around downtown Hamilton, where I live, holding it up in front of passing cars, and they'd lean on their horns. That, I hope I've summed up, the emotional equity I've built in the Raptors, and I probably should feel a little embarrassed by it. But that's where I'm coming from while we speak with Doug Smith. obviously the Raptors are this massive, billion-dollar corporate product. I can look at that objectively, but just know that they tapped into something truly organic. And wherever, I wind up, we had the spring of 2019 that, brought me back to my inner hopeful 18-year-old. And we will always have it, Neil.
Thank you very much, Nate. And coming up after the break, Doug Smith and We the North. Well, we're back on SportsLit, and we have Doug Smith, the Toronto Star Raptors reporter, with us, and now he is obviously the author of We the North, which celebrates the first 25 years of the Toronto Raptors. And I have to ask you, Mr. Smith, do you think that the Raptors championship helped with the idea of selling this book? Because we know publishing's obviously a business, and generally they're putting out hockey books this time of year on whoever it could be Rick Vive, it could be anyone. You don't normally see a lot of basketball books or books on TFC. So do you think, in addition to it being the 25th anniversary, it's also the championship helped sell this?
I think it absolutely. I think it gave it a laser-like focus on the end of the book. You go through the 25 years and you finish with the parade and the championship. But I do think there was a quarter of a century tale to be told anyway. I don't know if we would have done it. I don't know whether, I hope it's successful, but I think it probably would have been a little bit less so if you didn't have the memory of 2019 in the fans' minds. It certainly didn't hurt, that's for sure.
Go ahead, Tate. Yeah, and I guess, now I shudder to use this term, the process of deciding to, avoid there easily could have been a book just on 2019, but what was the process of deciding, we have to tell this whole story of everything that led up to 2019?
Well, Nate, I think the interesting thing to me is that the journey is almost as much fun as as getting to the destination. And I think if you look at the evolution of not only the Raptors, but of basketball in Canada and in Toronto, it's the story of the trip that I think people want to know. And, there's been bits and pieces all along in the 25 years that have sort of led it to where it got to in 2019 that I think people might not known or might have forgotten. And I think a way to remind them is to sort of take them through. Obviously we didn't do year by year. We didn't do it entirely chronological because I think that gets a little bit repetitive and maybe a bit boring. But there were touchstone moments in those first 25 years that people need to remember or even learn about.
Indeed. And yeah, that's what I really liked about it. We had Jeff Pearlman on last month, and he talked about that's the thing you have to avoid is repetition of seasons. And as a reader, I felt like, we were having a beer and you were telling me, well, this is what I think about, this time in the Raptors history or this player. Do you have any sort of anxiety that, how readers will receive that, like in case they were maybe primed for something else?
Yeah, that was the anxiety. That was the stress, is how to structure it so that it's part memoir, it's part history lesson, it's part sociology textbook, and trying to find that balance in those three things was a very difficult thing to do. Even when it came down to coming up with the 25 chapters. Obviously, like I said, we weren't going to do 25 years, but it also couldn't be 25 people. It had to be things that were a combination of issues, development, evolution, and obviously the people and events. The championship is the thing that anchors the last chapter of the book.
I was actually wondering, it just came to my mind, but just when you were describing the Bitov Slate kind of shotgun clause and how that, was that a common thing in sports? It seemed to be, I guess I'm surprised, given that they were both partners, that would be even, in the contract, to be quite honest with you. It seemed like a pretty, how do I say, kind of a dangerous thing in a sense, where someone would want to avoid that at all costs, but somehow it was part of this deal to get this franchise.
Yeah, I don't think it certainly wasn't common in sports, I don't think, but I believe it was much more common in big business. Because you guys know, when you start something as large as a sports team or any kind of major international global business, there's probably going to be bumps and there might be disagreements. And I think something like a shotgun clause allows things to shake out. And that's exactly what happened with this, and it shook out in the right way. It was tumultuous, to say the least. But things, like with all huge business operations, you're going to go through bumps, and things have to get to the smoothness, and there's going to be shakeout, and that's what that was.
I have to ask you, I want to ask you about Kawhi right now, to switch gears a bit. And I wanted to was there you described covering all of these guys, and Lowry, being a great guy, but he can be kind of prickly, and DeMar being great with the press. But, Kawhi not having said a lot, and you describe it in the book, he didn't have a lot to say, perhaps, in scrums. Was there a challenge in covering him? Because people wanted to know so much about him, and he was giving so little.
Yeah, there was a big challenge for all of us, and me particularly, is to try to draw him out, draw information from him. He answered our questions, but he answered them quickly and very shortly, not tersely, but shortly. And the good stories come when you can draw people into conversation and develop things from there. Something you might talk about with them on a Tuesday, you might not use until the following Thursday, but it's a seed that's planted. I don't know that guarded is the right word that Kawhi is to describe Kawhi, but I think reticent and not at all. He didn't care. He didn't want to do it, and it wasn't important to him. And he answered, like I said, he answered our questions and fulfilled his obligations that way. But there was no extra. There was no conversational tone to it, like there is with so many other players.
The thing that I thought a lot about, especially when the championship run ended and everyone was wondering if he was going to stay or not, was this idea of, there's this saying, the man, the myth, and the legend. And I think the myth part, now obviously that's a cliche, but the myth is kind of like a Babe Ruth, someone we didn't see play and we've just been told about. And I thought that he really put the myth back into the man, myth, legend thing, with people hanging on to everything he was doing. Whether it was going to a Blue Jay game or Niagara Falls or the Cactus Club, or I even heard rumors that his daughter was going to be enrolled in a private school here, so he must be staying. That whole part of his, the end of his time here. Do you kind of feel that lent to him being mythic per se?
Yeah, mythic and mystique. There was something about him we didn't know. He never spoke. His representation, his people didn't speak publicly at all during that whole, I guess, 4 or 5 week period where it was touch and go whether he would come or whether he would stay or go. And yeah, I think it adds a little bit of mystery to him. And just like it was mysterious when he got here, it was mysterious when he left. And I think that's in some ways pretty good. I don't know that this team would have evolved like it will in the next 4 years if he had stayed. I think it in some ways was really cool that he came. He led them to a championship as a key part of it, but then he went away. And I think that kind of is part of the mystique and the mystery of Kawhi Leonard and his place in Toronto and Canadian sports history. I don't know. That's for the future to determine, I guess. But where does he fit? Do you retire his number or honor him some way for 1 year because the year ended up in a championship, or do you say, "Hey, thanks for this. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're part of it, but you're not really part of it"? I don't know. That's going to be an interesting take, I think, in the next 3 or 4 years of this team.
And you actually were the reporter who asked him the fun guy question, right?
Yeah, very first one. Because again, we didn't know much about him. A lot of us had been around the NBA and had seen him play in San Antonio and knew how good he was before the injury year, but no one knew anything about him. And I thought, okay, let's give him a chance to explain what he is, because he's meeting a whole bunch of people in a country for the first time. And at that point realized, okay, he's pretty guarded. He'll give us a little bit, but he's not going to give us an awful lot. I'm still a little bit ticked that I'm not getting residuals from the I'm a Fun Guy T-shirts, but that's another business point.
Yeah, is it possible that Kawhi Leonard is just like a shy? Like I read a book once called Goodbye to Shy, and it was just like they usually literally use it as a noun. Is that just what he is?
I think he's just private. Yeah, I don't know if shy is the right word, but I think he's just private. He doesn't care. He doesn't care that we don't know him. He doesn't care to let us know him. And that's fine with me. That's fine with him. And as long as he, does what he needs to do professionally for his team, and in his interactions with the media to take care of obligations the league and the team have on him, he doesn't want to do the rest of it. And that's okay, as long as he's fair enough when we do need to talk to him. I mean, it's our challenge to try to change him, but we couldn't, and I don't think we would have if he had stayed for 5 more years. I think he would have gone the other way. He might have become more withdrawn with the constant every day, Kawhi, tell us something about you. He doesn't want to tell us anything about him.
And of course, you've seen you've probably talked to every Raptors player in 25 years.
There are an awful lot of them.
Yeah, guys come and go. How do you hope this sort of maybe humanizes some of the players that had all the demands put on them, who had to be the face of the franchise, whether it was Damon Stoudemire in the early years, Vince Carter right at the turn of the millennium, or DeMar DeRozan, in recent years?
I think the one thing that's been consistent with this team is its best players have always been really good with the media. Damon, Vince, Chris Bosh, DeMar, even Kyle Lowry after a bit of a rocky start because he didn't particularly want to be here and he wasn't particularly friendly. But now he's conversant. The one consistent thing is they've all been willing to talk. They might not say anything, but they'll talk pregame, they'll talk postgame, they'll talk after practice, they'll talk after shoot-arounds. And as a reporter, that's basically all you can ask. Then it's up to you to get them to talk about something interesting. But they've all the best players on this team have always been willing to do that. And I've been around the NBA for a quarter of a century. That's pretty unique. We're kind of spoiled up here that the media as a whole has been treated so well by the best players on the team.
And I wanted to ask too, how is being around these guys for 25 years, how has it sort of maybe have affected your worldview? I think of an article you wrote last week where there was a story that I guess it was about a 2-day story. Oh, the Raptors might play in Louisville, and I think you wrote an article like, there's no way these guys will accept playing in Louisville after the Breonna Taylor shooting.
Yeah, that was just a non-starter, and I can't believe it had legs for even for 36 hours, and I was going to ignore it, but then it wouldn't go away. But the players now, there's just so much more media. There's so many more people picking at them, asking them questions, wanting their time, that they just don't want to do as much, because they know that if they say something to one guy and it becomes a story, then it's got to be answered again tomorrow by another guy, maybe 2 days later if the story has a lot of legs. They don't want to go through that. So they might talk, but they're not going to say anything outrageous generally because they don't want to be bothered by it. And if they have a message they want to get out now, this day and age, they have their own way to do it, whether it's the Athletes Tribune or their own websites or their own Instagram accounts or whatever it is. They're able now, in this day and age, to bypass the media, which I think is bad because it doesn't allow anybody to ask them the follow-up question that we need to ask pretty much every day. But I've had players tell me privately, I'm not going to tell you anything because if I tell you something, then tomorrow somebody asks me about it again and I don't want to deal with it again.
So for this book, was there a lot of going back to was there actually were you calling players, or was it you just based entirely on your memory and old articles? Did you have to revisit talking to some of the players from years past?
I talked to a lot of players, talked to a lot of management people, a lot of coaches, a lot of people around the team, back of the house guys, front office staff, sort of to confirm what I remembered, especially back in the 95 to 2005 era when it was pretty, outside of the Vince years, it was pretty bleak. And I would, this is what I think happened, but I have to check with someone to make sure my memory was right. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It wasn't calling to interview to get news, but it was calling to confirm what I thought I remembered. And basically, generally, I was pretty right. I got a pretty sharp memory, as it turns out. But then that's the kind of process that it basically was okay. This should be in the book, but I want to make sure with this guy that this happened this way, and that was the process of information gathering, if you will.
Were you approached by the publisher, or did you approach the publisher to do this?
Well, there were some mutual friends who sort of knew publishing people at Penguin Random House who knew me, who thought, okay, maybe there's a book here, let's get them together. And the first time I met with Nick Garrison, who was the editor on the project with Alana McMullen, it was, okay, how do we envision this? How do we see this? Like, well, what is it? And then it was a matter of me sitting down and getting 25 chapters and 25 themes to develop, but it was just kind of put together by mutual friends of the publishing industry and basketball.
So right now, I want to switch again to ask you a little bit about retiring numbers, and I'm sure you've been asked about this before, but I've always been of the mind that maybe the Raptors have a clean slate here, and they could almost create a criteria like the Baseball Hall of Fame has, where there's a set guideline and certain things that must be met to have your number retired. Would you agree that may be a good way to go? Because it seems to me, and I'm just speaking from the outside, that every team is different in how they pick who goes up there, and it can almost depend on who's in management at that time.
Yeah, I can't. And what relationships are. Like, you got a guy who left on bad terms. You want to honor him, even though he did great things for the franchise. Yeah, my point has always been, first of all, you cannot retire the number of a player who's still active anywhere in the sport. Can't do it. Can't do it until they're retired. I firmly believe that. I'm not sure you could have like strict statistical guidelines, but I do think it's got to be hard. It's got to be special. I think people retire numbers and honor players far too easily. Halls of Fame let people in way too easily. It's got to be the absolute pinnacle. And I think it's more than just what they do on the court. It's what they do for the franchise, for the city, for the game. I think today, the only player in Raptor history you could possibly consider would be Vince, because Kyle's still active, DeMar's still active. Maybe Damon would be, and then Damon Stoudemire would be on that list. But, he was only here 3 years, and he didn't win an awful lot. So this franchise has been so weird in that it's had all the real success has been the last 6 years, that there's a recency bias there that I think is wrong. But you have to look at a far bigger picture when you're giving somebody what is the ultimate honor. I'm not even sure it's retiring a number. Maybe it's a statue. I don't think retiring a number to the Raptors of an arena where less than 1% of your fans will ever be is the best way to honor a guy. Make it outside, everybody can walk by and see it. If it's in the arena, you guys know, 99% of Raptor fans from around Canada never will be in the Scotiabank Arena for one reason or the other. But they might all be around Toronto. And I think there's a way to let them be involved in the process, in the honoring, and see it, as opposed to just hanging a banner with the number 7 or the number 15 on it.
Yeah, nail on the head. And that sort of brings us to, Vince Carter, half man, half amazing. The book really, forced me to sort of confront, some of the feelings I had about, the way he left. But what was the true legacy of the Vince Carter years with the Raptors, I guess, 1999 to 2004?
Well, I don't think it's as ultimate as there might not be Raptors if there wasn't Vince Carter, but it's not that far off. He gave the team a legitimacy it never had, because he became this global phenomenon. That 2001 dunk contest, the 2000 dunk over Frederick Weiss in the Olympics, that was the Toronto Raptor doing it. And it might have been the first time anybody outside of Toronto or Canada had paid attention to the Toronto Raptors. And I think that will be his legacy, that and the number of kids who are now playing basketball because he was here. And you guys know, in the city of Toronto, the game has taken off exponentially in the last 20 years. And I think it's because there were a lot of 7-year-olds watching Vince Carter in 2000 who are now 27 years old still playing the game. And I don't think you can diminish that impact on not just the Raptors, but on the whole basketball in Canada process. And I think that needs to be thought of as probably his first legacy, is what he did for the game in the country.
What I'd like to see, and I find this is kind of included in a lot of articles about him, and when people talk about him, especially south of the border, is that there was nobody knew anything about basketball here, and I before he came, and that's the part that really sticks with me, because I mean, me and Nate are old enough to remember the Jordan years, and that all of our friends watching basketball, and I actually remember reading the part in the book about you talking about I think it was during the FIBAs where the guys explaining how long the basketball court is or something like that, and for me, it was going to the draft and having them. I was at the 1995 draft, I believe, in Toronto, and they're explaining double dribble. So yeah, I mean, there's always this extra stuff thrown in with Vince, and I don't know necessarily if it has anything to do with him per se, but that there was this was there was tumbleweed going down Yonge Street. There was no basketball culture here, and to some degree, I disagree with that. So
that's a false narrative. There were basketball fans in Toronto before 1995, a lot of them. There weren't as many, obviously, as there were once the Raptors got here. But yeah, that's a false narrative that we were this sporting backwater who didn't know anything about basketball, because that's simply not true. It was enhanced greatly by first the Raptors, then Damon, and then Vince. But yeah, we weren't like Hicks who just wore hockey pads to school. That's what you might hear. You might hear that in places today, but obviously it's not true, and it wasn't true back then.
Yeah, something I think all three of us have in common is we all kind of grew up in Ontario border towns. Like, what can you sort of tell our audience about there was that grassroots love for basketball in pockets across Canada long before 1995.
I grew up in Niagara Falls, Ontario. I went to probably 10 times as many Buffalo Braves games as I did Toronto Maple Leaf games. That's what we did. It was like half an hour across the border, and you get a ticket, and I loved it. It was great. Ernie DiGregorio, Bob McAdoo, Jack Ramsey was the coach, Tom McMillan. It was Randy Smith was one of the more underrated players in the NBA maybe ever. But yeah, Windsor was another great hot spot. Halifax was a big basketball city. There were pockets of basketball in Canada long before '95 that were finally getting served with two teams with Vancouver till they left, that they could call their own.
So Doug, I want to get you now to read a portion of the book for us, and this is the portion. This is basically where you were when the shot, and by the way, I'll set this up. You have a chapter called the two shots, basically, and it was what happened with Vince and then what happened with Kawhi, both against the 76ers, both in Game 7, both right at the end of the game in buzzer beaters, and two divergent storylines essentially on the same play per se. So could you go ahead and read that if you have the book in front of you?
Absolutely, yeah. I have it right here. Here we go. All right. The intensity in the building that day was something I've never felt before in all the years covering the team. Everyone knew the stakes. The Leonard trade was made for moments like this. A second-round exit would have been a colossal disappointment. It was, once again, the most important game in franchise history. Sitting on media row, I once again had a perfect angle to watch the shot. When I left his hand, the buzzer sounded, and the balance of two teams' championship hopes hung on which way the ball would bounce. And nobody could have predicted what came next. The ball hit the rim and bounced up. Everybody in the arena, along with everyone watching outside in Jurassic Park and across the country, held their collective breath. A second bounce on the rim, and suddenly it seemed like maybe, just maybe, this sucker had a chance. A third bounce. Holy shit. On the fourth bounce, the ball seemed to rest gently on the basket, like a moment frozen in time. The first Game 7 series-clinching buzzer beater in NBA history. Pandemonium. I told him to bounce it 3 times on the rim. Nurse joked afterwards, not 4. Nick Nurse, the coach. My immediate reaction? Disbelief. No one could have dreamt of this playing in their backyard growing up. A 4-bounce shot to win a playoff series in a Game 7? Unbelievable. My second thought? Man, it looked just like the shot Carter took 18 years earlier. The parallel of the two shots was incredible. I talked to Carter about it recently, and he agreed. It was amazing to see, Carter said. It was, you look at it, you just turn it over and flip it on the side. Here's what this would have looked like. That's basketball. Yeah, that's basketball. No better way to put it. The absolute beauty of sports. One shot goes in, one doesn't. One brought absolute joy, one brought absolute dejection. Sometimes you do everything to prepare for that moment. and spent hours, years honing your craft, working on every single shot, preparing for that moment when you can be the hero. But when the ball goes up, you're really at the whim of the basketball gods. People like to debate end-of-game play calls that are always open to second-guessing. And, of course, shots like Carter's and Leonard's in Game 7 will be replayed and talked about from now until eternity. A lot of times, whether it's a good play or not, just depends on whether the ball goes in the net when the buzzer sounds. I didn't see the photos of Leonard's shot until later that evening. You'd see it all on all the players' faces, on the Raptors and the Sixers. They were all in disbelief. They didn't know what to do. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before. And it was true. It was the first time a Game 7 ended on a buzzer beater. The pictures of Leonard's shot is going to go down as one of the best sports photos in Canadian sports history. It's not even close. It's not the same sport, but I think it's right up there with Paul Henderson's game-winning goal in the 1972 Summit Series, and probably even bigger than when Donovan Bailey won the 100-meter Olympic gold medal at the 96 Summer Olympics in Atlanta. Just like Carter's shot, what Leonard did changed the trajectory of this franchise. Without it, they lost again in the second round, and the one-year experiment with Leonard would be considered a failure by a lot of people. I would still argue that it was a no-brainer trade for Masai Ujiri, and if they went for it and didn't get the ultimate prize, you couldn't blame them for going for it in the first place. You take your shot when you think you have a chance. Without the shot, though, there would be no championship, no parade, no legacies for all the players on the Raptors who will forever be celebrated in the city. It would have changed the summer, too. Kyle Lowry probably would have returned. He definitely would not have returned with signing an extension. It's likely Ujiri would have explored trade options for Serge Ibaka and Marc Gasol and hastened the entire process of turning the page on this roster. Instead, the Raptors are defending champions. That's how fragile sports is. 2 shots, 2 different outcomes. There you go.
Thank you, Doug. That was well read.
My pleasure.
And well written. I want to ask you about Masai. So Kawhi's gone, and it's a bit disappointing, but as you frame it, it's almost this amazing mythic story. He's, he came, he did, he conquered, and now he's gone. But Masai, I mean, if you're a pessimistic Raptor fan or a doomsday type guy, and you read,
what are you talking about, Neil?
Page 132, in your book, and I'm going to read it to you. When Ujiri does move on from the Raptors, they will miss his dynamic nature. There are a lot of smart people in the front office, but no one will come close to having the charisma and ability to rally an entire city, an entire country like Ujiri has done. He's been the face of the franchise for almost a decade now. When he's not here anymore, the next guy is going to have a really hard job. Until then, in Masai we trust. I started thinking about Kawhi on the stage at Nathan Phillips Square, and you kind of got the feeling he was leaving. So I guess what I'm getting to, as an insider, Mr. Smith, are you letting us know something here? Is Masai is he going to go?
Well, I've said for as long as this has become an issue for the last 2.5 years, that this is certainly not his last job. He's early 50s. He's not done his things in life in Toronto. He's going to find some other challenge. I don't think it's going to be running a basketball team, because there's a lot of been there, done that with him in that regard. But I think he has a bigger role to play in the world somehow. I don't know what that is, whether it's a foundation, whether it's his Giants of Africa, whether it's running a league or advancing the social justice causes or anti-racism or indigenous rights. I honestly don't know. Maybe it has to do with Africa. But he's not finished his life. This is not going to be his last job. I don't know when he's going to go. Maybe it's not for 5 years. Maybe no challenge presents itself to him until then. But at some point, something's going to come up where he's going to say, yeah, that's what I want to do next. And he's going to go do it. And it's going to be too bad. And it's going to be sad for the city, sad for the franchise. But I don't think anybody can blame him for seeing something bigger on the horizon that he wants to go do, because he's reached the pinnacle of this sport. And I think there are other things out, maybe even outside of basketball entirely, that will be intriguing when they present themselves. But they're not there yet. I fully expect he will sign another contract here. I mean, it might be open-ended. It might have a lot of outs, but I certainly don't think this is his last job.
Yeah. What about maybe making Masai Ujiri the first Raptor statue outside the arena?
I think there's absolutely a case for that to be made, because what he did when he came back in 2013, 2014 was instill in this whole team and the city and its fan base a sense of, yeah, we're good enough. We're not. We don't need to hear this crap about no one wants to come to Toronto. We're going to make it so people want to come to Toronto. If they don't want to come to Toronto, screw them. We're going to win without him. Oh, I think he's absolutely would be on a very short list once he's done with the Raptors as the guy that you want to honor in some historic way.
What I do hope is Majuri really seems to get the bigger picture on everything, and I hope if he does plan on leaving, he does have the right people here to follow what he's done, because I mean that would be devastating. I think I think he does. I think he knows that. I think he needs to get, as he said when they gave Nick Nurse a contract extension, he's going to take care of his people, and his people are good. Bobby Webster is as highly regarded a general manager as there is in the NBA, and Masai will take care of him as a sort of succession plan. Same with Dan Tolson, the director of scouting. Teresa Resch, who's director of basketball operations, I believe her title is. These kind of people are vital to Masai and will be vital to the next wave of the Raptors, and he's going to take care of them. That's the thing he's going to do.
And now just making a 90-degree turn, to the bad old days.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The book has a really tight narrative, which I like. But what kinds of stories about, say, I don't know, Keon Clark or Matt Bonner or a coach like Kevin O'Neill might have ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak?
There's a couple that probably could have got in there, snuck in there somehow, but didn't. Keon Clark, for instance, I don't know. At one time, for some reason, we were in a scrum one night, I think in New York, somewhere on the road. And someone asked him a question, and he looked right at me, and he goes, "I'm not answering that question as long as he's here." And I said, "What? Why? What?" He goes, "You know what you did." And I said, "No, I swear, Keon, I have no idea what I did to obviously tick you off." He goes, "No, we're not talking." And the conversation ended, or we all walked away. And I went to Jim Bombard, the PR guy at the time, and I said, "Jim, check with Keon. What did I do?" Came back to this. Keon says, I go, "Dude, I have no clue what I did." And a couple of weeks went by, and pretty soon he was talking to us again. And I had no idea, still to this day, no idea what kind of thing I'd done to him to make him so ticked off. Oliver Miller, I think this story is in the book. At one time, his first go-around, decided he didn't want to talk to the media for whatever reason. Oliver was as bad a guy as I've ever covered. But he did tell us, "You guys are on 3 weeks probation. I'm not talking for 3 weeks." And Charlie Lemmix from Broadcast News at the time looked at us and said, "We still get paid, right?" So those kind of things. There's a couple of those stories that probably could have made it, but I didn't know where they fit. You see the way the book's structured. I don't know where that Keon Clark story would have fit. That's the kind of thing.
I was thinking about maybe Charles Oakley collecting his debt. Maybe I don't know if I skipped over that part by accident, but yeah, that was one of the instances I thought of. Didn't he collect a debt at a morning shoot-around?
The morning shoot-around of Game 7 against Philly in 2001. Tyrone Hill owed him a lot of money. Paid him in a gym bag full of cash, and we asked Oak, "That's settled, right?" Oak goes, "No interest, that's not settled." That's the kind of thing was. But yeah, there could have been an entire, Charles Oakley could have been entire 2 chapters in a book because he's such a fascinating character, but I think it would have taken away from the 25-year breadth of it and that kind of thing. Maybe there's a Oak sequel. I don't know. Maybe there's some next book on the weird guys around the Raptors and just do 25 people as opposed to 25 things.
Yeah,
maybe do that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Do that at 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. And the other one I just thought of too is how many times I've run into Matt Bonner in a short time here on the subway. It's things like that. So
great guy. Matt's a great guy. He's a great guy. Matt Bonner still is. Just I love him. Good person.
Actually, since I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Vince Carter's last game in Toronto when he not playing, but when he was on the bench, was a game where the T-Wolves and the Raptors played, and Kevin Garnett and Bonner got into it. and I think that may have started the legend of Bonner. I'm not 100% sure, but I seem
they threw Matt out of the game for trying to fight Kevin O'Neill. Kevin Garnett. It was a classic moment. Bonner left like a boxing champion, hands above his head.
You're chanting his name. I remember from the Sprite Zone.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so you did sort of touch on this, but I'll ask you again in a different way. And in writing about the first 2.5 decades, we see how much growth and evolution there was to get to the point of where the Raptors are now, which is respectability. So I guess maybe extrapolating on what we talked about Masai and what he may leave behind, what's it going to take to maintain this going forward for the next 25 years?
Well, obviously on-court success is the key, because it brings attention and it brings talent and a lot of other things. But I do think the Raptors' next thing is to be a bit even more socially aware and socially responsible, and where they fit into the greater Canadian and Toronto culture. I think they've done a really good job, along with the NBA so far, of advancing the causes of social injustice, against social injustice, fighting racism, systemic racism. I think that continues. That's the next plateau, the next climb for them, and to do it more on a nationwide scale. It's very hard and it's very time-consuming. It's not going to happen overnight, obviously. But I think that kind of social responsibility is the next thing that they do a little bit more. Obviously the basketball is the driver. You have to have a good team, and you have to be competitive, and you have to have good players and good people on your squad. But I think there's a way for the Raptors to become even a bigger thing than just a basketball team. And I think they accept that responsibility, and they're trying to figure out how to fulfill it.
Yeah, and what part of outreach that outreach involves, developing, I guess maybe, being part of developing other basketball properties. You have Kia Nurse, obviously, as one of the narrators of the audiobook. I saw her play with her, Connecticut Huskies team in Toronto, 3 years ago. And the arena at Ryerson was just packed with parents who brought their daughters to see UConn play. When do you, I guess what I'm getting around is, when do you think MLSE's, array of sports properties might include like a WNBA franchise, or they might do more things with like international basketball or even U Sports basketball, something you've always championed?
I think the WNBA is coming. I think that they need to see the WNBA as a better, more stable business proposition. WNBA is coming through some really rocky times. So less than a year ago, it didn't have a CBA. It had a new commissioner, Kathy Engelbert. It had none of its franchises are making any kind of money yet. But I think it's on the right track to becoming a solid business proposition, and that's when Maple Leaf Sports will jump in. I think they see the need for it. I think they see the good it would do for the game, for them. It's another, maybe one of the smaller arenas, Rico, or out here in Mississauga, maybe like play in a lesser sized building than Scotiabank, obviously. But it also sends a message that they're developing the game at all kinds of other levels. I don't think they can do. I think they would love to be able to do something with U Sports, but they can't, because they can't let the American NBA teams do anything with NCAA teams, and that dynamic is there. Maybe there is some sort of academy process, like the great European soccer clubs have, where there are Raptor academies across the country that are not affiliated with anything but the team. Maybe that's a way that they can sort of advance their role in the sport development. All kinds of interesting things I think are possible. It's just a matter of the money, the wherewithal, and the commitment to do them. And I think they're examining a lot of different things, but I don't know what's going to happen when.
Yeah, and I'm already envisioning myself like going to maybe a early Sunday afternoon Toronto WNBA game at Rico, and then just walk right over and watch Toronto FC maybe. But speaking of the one adjunct team they do have, how far ahead on the player development side? How far ahead of the NBA curve were they with what they've done with Raptors 905, and why has that been maybe slow to catch on in the WNBA or in the NBA? Pardon me.
I think they were in sort of the middle wave. There are a bunch of teams. Houston was one that started right off the bat with its own franchise, physically close to Houston, so that guys can come back and forth easily every day. I think you're eventually going to see 30 NBA teams with 30 G League affiliates who are in close proximity to their NBA teams, so that guys can practice at 11 o'clock with the NBA team and play at 7 o'clock at night with the G League team. I think that's a huge thing that the Raptors did, and it took them a little bit longer than they wanted to. They needed to get a commitment from the league, the commitment from the people of Mississauga to find a place to play, that kind of thing. Put it all together was a process. It's losing money, not a lot of money, but it's losing money every year. But that's okay because it's just a developmental cost. And we've seen it with guys like Siakam, Fred VanVleet, Norm Powell, Jalon Wright before he got traded, Chris Boucher. We've seen how important having those guys around the NBA team and then playing in the G League is. They become better players quicker. And I think eventually every NBA team is going to mirror that. But that's been a huge part of what turned it around for Toronto. You guys know Bruno Caboclo had as much skill as a lot of players I've ever seen, but they lost him because they had no place for him to play. They didn't have them in the South. They didn't have the 905s. He had to go play in, I think, Erie and maybe a bit of time in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where they didn't care. They didn't give a rat's ass about Bruno Caboclo. He was a guy from Toronto. What did they care? If the 905 had existed when he came in, I think he would have been an entirely different story with him. I think they made a mistake. They should have sent him to Europe where they could have got some control to a friendly team rather than let him basically waste a year and a half not being around. The NBA teams don't practice an awful lot. He had language issues. I think the existence of the 905 would have made it a lot easier for him, and I think that's why you're seeing their young developmental players are so much better, so much further ahead than so many teams in the NBA.
Couple of last questions for you here, Doug. And the first is something I actually passed over by accident, and now I want to get to. So you write about a turning point, and you go directly to Dwayne Casey. And I wanted to ask you about some other turning points. And a lot of people talk about Kobe's 81-point game, and how great it was, and it was great. But that also affected the franchise in that Rob Babcock was fired very quickly after that. So was Kobe indirectly, did he indirectly aid the Raptors maybe righting the ship, per se?
I'm not sure that one game did. I think the Raptors knew, the day of the Vince Carter trade sealed Rob Babcock's fate because the return was so bad. That was the point that not only did he lose support, I don't think he had a lot of support from the players, and when he made that, he lost all. But I think his bosses at that time went, oh, my goodness, we got to get this fixed. And it took a little while, but they did. I think that was obviously a bad hire. And I don't want to speak ill of the dead, and Rob's passed away. And I like Rob. Rob Babcock was a genuinely nice man, hardworking, but he was not the leader of a sports franchise. And I think if you ask Richard Petty to this day, that's the one regret. That's the hire. And, okay, it set them back some time. Set them back a couple of years, no problem. But they finally figured out, okay, this isn't working. Let's get this fixed. I think Casey was a huge turning point when he came here because he was consistent in treating the players well, treating them like men, sort of like family, and he built a foundation that allowed them to become this pound the rock, all for one. He and Kyle Lowry butted heads for a year and a half. They just didn't like each other. They didn't get along. But Dwayne was professional and personal and supportive and never publicly killing his players, and he won him over. And they enjoyed, until 2019, their greatest success with Kyle Lowry. Because with Kyle Lowry and Dwayne Casey, when they got to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2015, 16, 17, whatever the year was, when Cleveland beat them in 6 games, Casey's unwavering professionalism and niceness allowed that to happen.
Now I want to, I guess, finally ask you about the parade, which is a really interesting part of this book, because I really liked how you basically woke up and you wanted to go, and then you looked at the GO trains passing by and you said, you know what, I'm just going to have this moment by myself and watch it at my local pub.
I stood on the platform at Clarkson and watched four or five full trains go through, and I thought, no, there's no way. I'm not doing it. I'm too old. I can't get near them. I don't care that much. I want to go. I want to enjoy this by myself, and I did. I sat at my local and had a couple.
Yeah,
for like 9 hours of the parade, but however long it took.
Yeah, I did the sort of the same thing. It's like, I'm gonna go, and then I just thought, no, it's just gonna be a crush of people, and then it was like 3:00 in the afternoon, and they still haven't even really got to the speeches.
Yeah.
And I started off like basically eating my breakfast to the parade, eating my lunch to the parade, going to the gym, and the parade is still, and the thing's still going on. Anyway, Neil.
No, I was going to say I actually went because I live downtown, and it was actually terrifying at one point. I mean, there was actually, it almost reminded me of, I don't know if you remember about that Liverpool Stadium disaster they had
1989.
There was people being hauled like up onto the concourse at Nathan Phillips Square because just to save them from getting crushed. But I mean, I didn't want to make this a negative ending. The reason I brought up the parade is because I mean, their estimates are high. I don't know the exact number of people, but there was a lot of people. And do you think that's a testament to the Raptors just being so inclusive from day one, because they had to be, I mean, to sell tickets, but just people jumping on board with this? I mean, you always look at the Leafs as kind of a club you had to get into, like your dad's banker had tickets for it, and you'd be lucky to get to a game, right? And whereas the Raptors, you could, as you wrote, you could get the tickets at Shoppers Drug Mart, and you could go and you could be part of something from the start. So just having all those people out there on that day, was that, I mean, how did you view that when you looked at 25 years of history?
It was funny. The one thing I thought of, and I've said this many, many times, is that day, the Raptors reminded me of Canada. If we looked at that crowd, it looked like Canada. It looked like my country, my city. I don't think you would have seen that with a hockey parade, and I think it's because the Raptors have been inclusive. They play a global sport. 25 years ago when they came here, if there was a 7-year-old immigrant from Europe or the islands or Asia, he or she probably knew basketball, and they finally had a team they could grow up with. And if you looked at the people around Jurassic Park outside the arena during the games, the people at the parade, the people at the Jurassic Parks throughout the country, they were truly reflective of Canada. And that's a testament to the Raptors, because they welcomed these people in as fans. Well, they needed them back in '95, but they nurtured them, and they nurtured the game, and they nurtured their presence in their communities. And it's given them, I think, a huge advantage over every other professional sports team in the country, because it reaches so many people of so many different looks, backgrounds, ethnicities, ages, economic situations. And that's the thing they should probably be most proud of.
Well, we're really happy to have you to join us for this long today, Doug. And I wanted to ask you in closing, is there anything you wanted to add? I know there's talk of an audio book, or maybe it's already been recorded. Anything you want to add that maybe we didn't ask you?
No, I think we covered a lot of stuff. This was great. I really appreciate the whole depth of the conversation. But yeah, the audio book is out the middle of November, and it's Kia Nurse has done the foreword by Vince Carter, and Matt Devlin has done the narration of the body of the book. I'm really, really looking forward to hearing that, because those are two great Canadian basketball voices, and I really think that'll be good. No, I just hope people enjoy the book, and they enjoy the book for what it is. It's a run through 25 years. It's been a lot. It's a lot of memories. It's a lot of me, and I kind of like that. And I hope the people who buy it enjoy it that way.
Thanks for sharing that with us, Doug, and all the best with the book going forward.
Yeah, thank you
My
so
pleasure,
much,
guys. Thanks very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.